customer education can't just focus on the clicks. It has to really focus on the jobs to be done. What is it that customers are trying to do and why? How is it driving the most value? And most products that I've been at, there's 3 or 4 ways to do a simple thing, and depends on how you do it, changes the output. So really teaching people the scenarios, the why to choose something becomes really important.
And that's what's on my mind. I'm Harold, and this is my Curious Corner. Hi everyone, excited for you to join me this week and very excited to have Debbie with us. I've been a big fan of Debbie's work around certification and debunking what certain terms mean in customer education for a while. I first came across Debbie's work listening to the C-Lab podcast with the previous episode, which you saw with Dave Darrington as well. So excited to do some myth busting today and figure out what actually real customer education means. So welcome so much to the podcast, Debbie.
Thanks so much for having me, Harold. Excited to talk to you today.
So I'll start off with this, Debbie. How did you land in the weird and wonderful world of customer education? What was that journey like?
So it's funny, I've actually been doing customer education since before I even had the words customer education, which was interesting to me. I started doing customer education when I was educating principals and school boards on programs that we were offering at a Florida virtual school. And I worked in a couple other jobs where I was also doing customer education. And then when I got to QuickBase is when I met my people. So I met Adam and Dave initially, and then started meeting a whole lot of people around customer education and joined CEdMA, which I eventually joined the board. And what really got me excited, and the reason I've stayed with customer education, because I've been in L&D, I've done HR, I've done sales enablement. But with customer education, we don't educate customers so they learn. Learning is the tool that we use to drive adoption, decrease churn, decrease support tickets, right? So it's a tool. And what that means is we have measurable impact. So when I was at QuickBase, I had the numbers to prove that there was a strong correlation. And in fact, there was an 11% increase in ARR. We did MRR then. For people who took e-learning, 25% increase in MRR for people who took instructor-led training. But what really got me was the 69% increase in MRR, ARR for customers who had a certified builder. And even more impressive was we had 0 churn if we had a certified builder. I was hooked because I had numbers. When I did HR, I wanted to do numbers, but they weren't interested in an HR. Today, they're getting there, right? But for me, that data was really impressive because I'm a data geek. I love to play in the data.
So it feels like your journey has been almost kind of the journey of SaaS in a way. So you move from teaching to HR, and during that time, roughly 2010s to about 2015, SaaS boomed as an industry. And you kind of grew alongside that. And it's very interesting what you're saying with the distinction between internal and external training, or L&D, and customer education. Often there's terms like culture or skills within the HR world, which isn't quantifiable metrics, but you can actually bring to the C-suite, this is the value I'm adding through customer education.
Exactly, because we're more about the data, and it's harder to get data when you're in HR than it is when you're on the customer side of things or on the product side of things, because customer education can live pretty much anywhere today, and it does. And in most companies, you will see customer education ping pong. You'll see it move from one department to another. You'll see it pulled apart. They'll separate e-learning and the training teams and the certification teams, and they'll pull them all back together. And it's really interesting to watch that pattern at most companies, how they do that.
And it's a really interesting time we're in, because we're also seeing the term scaled customer success, or doing more with less. So it seems like customer education has always been a way to educate customers and doing more with less. But it seems like the industry is catching up and it's actually getting the seat at the table that is deserved all along.
That's absolutely true. And it's so funny because when you start as an IC in customer education, you're in an individual role doing what we traditionally think of as customer education, which is certification, training, or e-learning, right? And those are sort of the traditional customer education space. As you move into manager, senior director roles, what ends up happening is you actually become responsible for community, for sometimes customer marketing, customer communications, knowledge base. Some people have help centers, some people have support under them now. And by any other name, those are all scaled success or digital success. We're right now in this phase where no one knows what to call us because you can see roles for any of those titles and they're identical roles at a senior director level because they're all managing the same thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, I mean, this industry loves terms, but sometimes terms don't matter. It's what impact are you actually serving? And I think it's also something that's accelerating a lot with customer education is moving from a sales-led growth to a product-led growth motion. And the idea that people are starting with a product, but they need the right education, even as prospects, but especially in the first phase, to then scale and drive those deliverables. So it's not just that you can do sales like growth, but in the AI era with SaaS, people actually want to prove that demonstrable impact and then scale as a part of that.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because as you mentioned, SaaS has really changed and the usability of products has gotten much better, right? So when you looked at how usable things were on the web in 2000, 2010, you needed to teach people where to click because people couldn't figure out where to click. Today, that's not true. People can figure out where to click. What they can't figure out on their own often is why to click where. So there's multiple ways to do things. So really understanding decision trees, and then customer education can't just focus on the clicks. It has to really focus on the jobs to be done. What is it that customers are trying to do and why? How is it driving the most value? And most products that I've been at, there's 3 or 4 ways to do a simple thing, and depends on how you do it, changes the output. So really teaching people the scenarios, the why to choose something becomes really important.
I think the other key differentiator, Debbie, between the internal L&D world versus the customer education world is you can't force anyone to do anything. Like you have to build consumer grade products because you can say, well, take the compliance course. Otherwise, your job depends on it. But on the other side, it has to be on par with Reddit or YouTube or wherever you get your instruction materials. Otherwise, people simply aren't going to engage with your product.
Yes, and it's so funny because you can tell when people have come from academics or from L&D and they want to force people to take courses sequentially, they want to force completion, or they want to require training. Well, as soon as you require training, you create hostile learners or malicious learners. So then we treat it the same way we treat compliance training. You sit there and you click, the video plays, you walk away, you come back and you do it, right? So what happens is you don't learn from it because you're forcing them to do things. People hate to be forced to do things. They hate lockdown navigation. So when people first come in from L&D or from academics, they're so used to that because of compliance training or the way we go through regular academic school that you have to do things sequentially. They try to do that in customer education and it doesn't work.
It's interesting because I've helped different clients launch customer education projects. And what they've said is it's all about who the audience is, right? So one client had all engineers. So they're very in depth, they're very methodical, and they wanted longer form, really deep content. And others were marketers. They wanted quick, snappy, on the go. So curious, when you've been designing these experiences across these SaaS companies, how have you kind of adapted to the different end users of the SaaS product?
So you have to know who your customers are and what space you're playing in. The thing that gets really interesting is the spaces that I usually end up playing in are sort of builder type platforms that are a lot of platforms where you have end users who want the more snappy, but then we have engineers. Engineers, for the most part, they would rather read. Front end marketing, they want video. So one of the things that I'm pretty adamant about when I create courses is there has to be a read version and a watch version so that you can read it or watch it. I also did some research with 1,500 users and asked about preferences for video and text and images. And 80% of them said they wanted a video the first time they saw it, but after the first, they wanted to be able to read it. So anything that I do, I always do a tabbed interface with read it and watch it to actually accommodate both. because for me, content reusability and scalability is huge because we need to be able to use our content everywhere now. And so you need both forms. So you need software or a tool that will do it in both forms for them. And then you need to be able to display it in both forms. And then you also need to be able to use it in a PowerPoint, in email, in community, in your learning management system, in product. We need content reusability across the board. So I think about that very differently now than what I did when I first started. When I first started, I was really focusing more on, I wanted multiple forms, but for a different reason. I wanted to do interactive simulations. I wanted to do a read it version that I could print out because people were still printing a lot. There are still people who do a lot of printing. So the reusability was important, but I was too focused on simulations, and that's something I don't do anymore. I don't do simulations for any software anymore.
Is that because the software is improving at such a rate that by the time you build it, it almost isn't usable? Or did you learn that simulations wasn't as effective as you thought? Or
I learned that simulations aren't effective. It's funny, I hear a lot of people still doing simulations, and that's their choice. But the problem with simulations, if you're doing a simulation that you've created in Storyline or Captivate or any of the other programs like that, is they're false learning because you're just teaching them where to click because they can't make mistakes. And most people actually learn best from making mistakes. So instead, something like a sandbox or something like a cloud share product that you actually have a copy of your platform where they can make mistakes is a better learning experience. So it's too time intensive and it's just not a good learning experience. And then depending on the company that you're at in SaaS now, I've been at companies that do product releases every 2 weeks, once a month, once a quarter, and if you're updating every 2 weeks or once a month, your stuff's out of date right away. And just changing the color of a button doesn't sound like a big deal. But I was at one company where we changed the start color from green to blue. Customers went berserk and we had to change it back. So that makes all of your content outdated. And when customers see the wrong color, they don't know how to react to it. The first thing they say is, this is outdated. So if that's outdated, then wait a second, all of the content is probably outdated. How valid is the content? So you're setting the wrong tone.
that trust element with the users. And interesting what you said around visualizations. And I think a good distinction is visualization versus the virtual lab. So collaborations with CloudShare and Skillable and others. And I think it's really interesting, particularly for customer education, allowing someone to try and fail in that safe environment because they can practice properly, but you could also see where they get stuck and you could use those data-driven decisions to then form the content or the customer education strategy from a better place. You actually know what they do wrong.
That's exactly right. Because when you're watching what they do, and customers never do what we think they're going to do. They don't do what we think they're going to do in product, and they don't do what we think they're going to do in our customer education courses or modules, learning paths. They just don't do it the way we think they're going to do it. And no matter how much time you spend upfront to think they do, if you ask them, they'll tell you one thing. But if you watch them, they'll do something different. So actually doing usability studies on your learning is really fun to do.
Very interesting. I want to dive a little bit deeper into certifications, Debbie, because this is a topic when chat a little bit before, seems like there's a lot of misconceptions. People think certifications is, compliance certifications, and it's very much not. So curious from your perspective, could you define it and maybe also share what people get wrong about certifications and customer education?
My biggest pet peeve is people who say certification with a small c. And you'll hear people do that now. Certification is certification, and certification is not training, unequivocally. It is not training. And in the United States, in the labor laws of 1999, it actually states that. So certification in the US actually means something. And it means that you have followed a process, which you need to document. Your test has to be secure. It has to be reliable. It has to be valid. Reliability and validity are really important because it makes it fair for everyone. It has to be, for that reason, it has to be proctored, or you have to be able to know who that person is that's doing it. And the purpose of certification is to validate people's skills, not to teach. So you have to follow the full psychometric development pattern. That doesn't mean it has to take a long time. I can develop a legally defensible, valid and reliable certification in 3 months. Probably even faster now with some of the new AI tools that are out there. There's a lot of ways to do this. And it's not as expensive or as time heavy as it used to be. People used to think that it was really hard to do. People used to also tell you it took 18 months to do it. That one company did 3 exams in less than a year, and they were all psychometrically sound. A psychometrician came in after I did and validated that they all were, and actually spent some time on the phone with her because she was asking how I did it so quickly, because she came from a world of academia where it did take 18 months to do it. It doesn't take that in SaaS. It can't take that, and you won't have a job if you're trying to do it in 18 months in SaaS. You need to be able to do it faster.
So because a lot of organizations, and I think this is on the vendor side, I think it's on the practitioner side as well, it's not one culprit, it's everyone's problem to try to solve. Because we're misdefining it, do you find that the actual badging or the certification, if you add it to a job application, it's kind of voided because we don't have a uniform standard or a way to, I guess, interrogate the certifications as such?
So people recognize when it's a real certification versus not. And I saw that when I was at Smartsheet. Smartsheet, before I started, did not have a real certification. They had training that they were calling a certification. When I changed it over, I had emails from customers thanking me for doing it because they recognized that now it meant something and it didn't actually mean anything before, because it wasn't a valid test. It wasn't reliable. If I took the test now and I took it in 10 minutes, I'd get very different scores. In a reliable and valid test, when you take the same test at different times, you're going to get very similar scores. If your scores are off the chart different, it's probably not a valid and reliable test if you're actually trying each time you take it. So customers recognized it. And if you're going to put the time into it, you want it to be reliable and valid. And when I was at Braze, we did an A/B test and we put partners through training, which they got a badge for, and we put them through a certification. And the ones who went through the certification and passed the certification actually made more money for the company than those who didn't. So we proved the value of an actual certification there. At QuickBase, we had all of the training available, so you could take all the training and not get the certification, and many did. But the ones who went through the certification actually were more valuable customers. Not only that, they had better career trajectories because they were certified in different levels and they could move into different things. So it's really a win-win for both the customer and for the company.
I think it's also this kind of human principle that, if you study for something and you actually put in the effort, you feel more proud of the outcome. It almost feels like you're cheating a bit if it's a bad compliance quiz that gives you a certification and a product. Whereas if you actually sit down and put the right time into it, it actually feels more worthwhile. At least I found that on myself. If you're doing certain things and actually put in the work, it feels more worthwhile.
I agree with you. And I also think it's going to become more important in the future. It's funny because I hear some people saying something different and they're saying it's not as important and it doesn't matter. And I disagree with them. And the reason I disagree is as we're moving and have been moving more away from bachelor's degrees in the US and jobs aren't requiring degrees, people want to prove their knowledge. And so as people can take different certifications and actually prove their knowledge and skills, it's a different level. Because if you're calling it a certification and it's really a certificate of completion, the certificate of completion, if there's a test to it, and there isn't always a test to the certificate of completion, but even if there is, no one has actually tested the reliability or the validity of it, so we don't know if those tests are even fair. So the fairness component is huge in certification because it means anyone with that certification has actually learned those things.
So let's imagine then, Debbie, that we are building our certification program. And let's say we're making a stew and we're adding all our ingredients to it. What would you say are the core ingredients that you need from a tech perspective? Think LMS, proctoring tool, maybe we talked about virtual labs. How would you kind of combine these into the program?
So I'm really an advocate for customer experience. I don't want to send customers to a different platform for their certification. So what I want is integrations. I want an LMS that I can integrate the certification. You need to have some type of multiple choice knowledge base, but to actually incorporate the hands-on labs on top of it is huge, but then also figuring out how you overlay the proctoring into it. So you need one system that actually has good integrations. When I look at an LMS, the most important thing for me is actually integrations, because I want a good customer experience and I don't want to send them all over the place. So I'm really careful about stacking that.
And when you think of, okay, let's say we have 10,000 users, and if I'm sending them all to the LMS, I'm breaking their flow of work and I need to change behavior. We all know changing behaviors aren't easy. So are you overlaying this program in product education, or would you still send them to the LMS? I guess, what are the pros and cons of that?
Absolutely sending them to an LMS, unequivocally, hands down. In product is something different. You can use headless to embed it, your LMS section in there. But in product, if you're talking about pop-up in product, which is usually how we refer to it in product, so it's pop-up, it can be checklists, it can be videos, that is performance support. That's not actually learning. It's just in time. So you really need an LMS for learners to be able to track their learning and to track their skills. So I think there's always going to be the need for the LMS, especially around certification, badging, credentials. All of that is going to be important that way. You need it for both customers, partners, and quite honestly, if I were a CEO of a company, I would make everyone who worked for me get certified in my product if I had a certification. If you're in support, if you're in sales, I think all sales reps should have to get certified in it. That way they're not going to sell vaporware. There's nothing more frustrating than sales selling vaporware, right? Marketing, not knowing the product, so that way they just create new terms, right? And so I think there's value in anyone who's in any type of customer facing role being certified in the product and knowing the product.
Absolutely. And I think the distinction there between in product with performance support and headless is an important one. I often say, oh, people want it in the flow. Well, let's define, do you want a pop-up that sends a link, almost like a knowledge base in your product, or actually headless and bring your own front end and embedding that in? So it's kind of it depends situation, I think.
It's definitely a depends situation. The other thing is it's really a technical question, because as a product team, think about it from the CPO's perspective. Am I going to take some of my engineers off building my product so they can embed an LMS? Yeah, probably not happening. I'd rather get out 2 new features than embed the LMS, right? Because you've got the whole CSS thing playing on. Most of the companies I've been at, although I've always wanted to do a headless, it's not enough of a value for my CPO to do it, because we can drive it just by putting a button in the nav menu that brings to the LMS, right? And so that's the easier for them to do usually. Headless LMS is really a sexy idea, but I haven't been successful at getting it implemented because of resourcing from an internal perspective.
So you mentioned integrations are the key component for an LMS. What would you say if you can pick a menu of top 5 or top 10 integrations? Doesn't have to be vendors, but categories of integrations. What is top of mind for you if you're going shopping?
So you have to have some sort of commerce, first of all, a certification integration, a badging integration, and usually I do want a separate badging. I don't actually want it in my LMS. And the reason for that is we're at the point where we have too many badgings. We have badging in community, we have badging in incentive programs, we have badging in the LMS. So I do want it external so everyone can use the same one. And then a proctoring service. And then, of course, a data connection, because you have to be able to connect to your CRM. Because if you don't have your data connected to your CRM, you're really doing yourself and your company a disservice. So those are the big ones for me.
So when you've seen this work really well, Debbie, are these pre-built integrations? Are you doing APIs? How much are you kind of configuring these to work the way you want to?
So when I first started doing the integrations, none of them existed except for the CRM. That one existed. Everything else, I had to start building using either APIs or getting 2 different teams from 2 different vendors together to actually create integrations for me. And I've done that 4 or 5 times, where I've had companies have to work together. And even when I look at new survey products. For example, I was talking to a new survey vendor, and well, the only way I'm going to buy your product is if you make it work with my LMS. If you can't make that work, and so I can have a seamless survey lesson in there, I'm not going to use your product. So I do a lot of pulling product teams together to see how they can play well together, because the only way I'm going to buy a new software is if it does integrate into what I'm doing.
Of course. Do you have an example of like when you set up a certification program, what steps you kind of did? What was some of the impact? You mentioned some great metrics in the beginning here of how you could prove that you're having this business impact. So curious to hear those examples.
So the terms that I use now are different than the terms I used to use. So I used to use the academic terms, which were the domains, right? So we had to know what the different domains are. I still need to do that, but now instead I call them the jobs to be done. And then we shorten it down to the one word to get the domain, right? So that connection. So understanding what it is the high level area, such as the one I was just setting up, you need to be able to analyze data. So the domain becomes analysis. But then under the analyze data, what are all the steps that you can do in our product to analyze data? And that list can, be 20, 30 things that you need to know and be able to do. So then I take it and I do a job task analysis. And a job task analysis, there's only a couple of survey companies that can actually do it in the fastest way for a learner or a user to take. And everyone will tell you it's information overload. Yes, it is, but it's still faster to do it that way with less clicking. So it's a matrix, a side-by-side matrix question that asks people how frequently you do this, how hard is it to do, who does it, and how important it is. So there's really 4 tasks around it. And you rate all of those tasks, and then I do some statistical analysis on it to figure out which things need to be tested on. Once we want to test on it, then we go into question writing. Now today, question writing is a lot easier because we can start it with AI. And that doesn't mean we finish it with AI. It's human done, but AI started. So AI can write some of the questions for us, and then we can go through and actually evaluate the questions. So we do a tech analysis on it. Is it technically accurate? Does each item only ask one thing? Are the questions well-formed? So we go through all of that. Then we go through and we do a modified ANGOF, it's called, where we actually say how many people would pass this question, how many would get it right. And it should be somewhere between 25 and 90. If it's less than 25, it's too hard. If it's more than 90% of them are going to get it right, it's too easy. And questions that are too easy are just as bad as questions that are too hard. So then I just take the average of all of those, determine the cut score, then do a beta, launch a beta with proctoring. And then after 30 days, I close it down and we're ready to go. And we have our whole certification done.
So you mentioned AI there and that it's speeding up, let's call it the grunt work, so you can actually spend more time analyzing. How have you seen over the past few years AI taking some of the workload off to actually allow you to analyze and architect rather than having to do every step here?
With Gen AI, we can upload content and have it start the beta. Now, we all know that AI hallucinates, right? And if you don't know the product, the questions will sound like they make sense to you, which is why your IDs and your cert person really need to know the product. So there's that piece. I also have a friend who has set up a GPT to do some of the analysis for her, and it uses all the documentation that she's already written, and she provides it on what is a good question, what's a bad question, what's psychometrically sound. But even through using that, it should be run through people to make sure that it's still accurate, because we do know it hallucinates.
That's pretty interesting though, because if you're plugging in, say, your knowledge base, and I don't know, you could use OpenAI and add APIs or something, the second something updates in your knowledge base, that will inevitably go into your knowledge repository, which you're pulling from. So we're still looking at the human, oversight with instructional designers or product experts, but you're getting to, let's say, review stage quicker, essentially.
Exactly. You get into review stage quicker. And then there's another problem with certification. So you can't actually change the questions in your certification once they're written. Because if you have a test today and you change it tomorrow, it's no longer the same test. So you're not sure if it's actually valid or reliable. So one of the things that I do is I put a year on my exams instead of a version number. So that way, every year there's a new exam, but I do keep it for a solid year. So that way, for that 1 year, it's consistent.
Interesting. That's the fairness element you talked about, because
Yes,
otherwise one, it becomes subjective and it might be easy for us to try to game the system. Oh, we want all our customers to be certified because it looks good, but it actually doesn't have that integrity throughout.
that's exactly right. And it's that fairness thing. If you take an exam that's really hard and then the product gets easier to use, so it becomes easier to pass the certification, and I call them both the same thing, it's really not the same thing. So it's unfair to people. So that fairness component is huge.
And I know that you've been involved in CEdMA and been a big advocate for doing certifications properly. And I'll ask a couple of questions about CEdMA here in a second. But if you're a new customer education practitioner and the exec team says, this sounds great, but I just want to churn it out quicker and I don't really care whether they're certified or not. How would you kind of arm that customer education practitioner with the right ammo to say why this matters?
Red Hat IDC has a great study with all the data in it about the real validity of it. But I'd say you probably shouldn't start with certification. You probably want to start with badging at that point because you don't want to do anything without having executive buy-in. And so it's often easier to start with badges. And the way I've approached it in the past is usually call them skills badges. And skills badges are essentially certificates of completion for taking a training and learning something. But every badge that I do always has at least a quiz associated with it. And when we do quizzes, the quiz have to tie back to the objectives, which I've sort of changed the way I do objectives is I don't do traditional learning objectives with Bloom's and follow the whole Bloom's thing. It's not that I don't agree with Bloom, but for adult learners, there's no adult learner that needs to be able to identify three things, right? They need to be able to do a task. So I tie everything back to the task instead of to Bloom's on the quizzing. So
the other thing that resonated a lot here, Debbie, is you mentioned tasks and coming back to the visualization angle. For looking at tasks, and learners don't have to do this, they want to do it. I think the idea of the simulated environments or the virtual sandboxes or labs is really interesting because it allows you to map the tasks in a different way and people to practice and actually get something out of it and get the scoring, the live feedback, and all of these things. So it feels like a more mature way to look at it than thinking of a learner in a sense they have to do it, but something that they actually want to do.
that's exactly how we have to think about it. The other thing that I think about often is when I was a teacher, I also taught at an alternative school where kids were sentenced to my classroom, literally. They would be sentenced to our school for 90 to 180 days. And it's not just those kids who had a bad feel about learning and about school, but a lot of kids have trauma in school. So using the word learner, I never address them as learners. It's always as a user because they're using the product, right? So I think about it that way or addressed by role, but avoiding the word learning because learning, unfortunately, has a negative connotation for a large population.
Absolutely. It also assumes you're forced rather than you want to do it. So I like the
Exactly.
term user. It's a good definition. And also resonate what you're saying, like, okay, certification is, let's say, the second iteration of what you should do. But again, you need to bring the organization along. So let's say you're doing badging and you're gathering metrics to prove if we do this badging, that is better on net revenue retention, or we could prove educated, qualified leads have a better conversion. Whatever metrics you need to do, depending if you're part of marketing, you could be part of go-to-market, customer experience. Customer education folks live in all kinds of different exciting corners, but
Yep.
find the metrics, prove success, and I guess go from badging and then upgrade to certifications. And I guess what we're saying is they are worthwhile doing, and you can prove that they have a better outcome, even though they take time.
Exactly. And it makes sense to have different types of badges because not everyone wants to get certified. And you shouldn't force people to get certified either because you're just setting yourself up for failure if you're forcing it. So you really want to have things that start with badging. And the other thing that happens with badges is people like to collect badges. Having smaller skills-based badges, Slack has great skills-based badges. And when they implemented that, they didn't do away with their certification. They added those on top of their certification. So they've got both of those things going.
It's like the difference between a power user and a super user or a super admin. Like power users, if you're doing one task, you might, okay, I'm going to get a skill on user management of set product because that's what I need to do as a power user. Whereas the super admin, they need to be that holistic expert. Whereas that's where certification makes sense because you need to verify that they know what they're doing.
Exactly. And certification, I think, becomes even more important if you're doing what a lot of companies are doing today, which is moving into a lot of partner-led growth. Partner-led growth is the thing that I hear educators, CEOs, CCOs, everyone's talking about, growing through partners today. If you don't know for sure that your partners are doing well on your behalf, you can get in a lot of trouble and they can actually cost your company money. So once partners become a focus, that's when certification really becomes important. And in your partner program structure, some companies will have partners across the board, and not only certified partners are the ones that they'll refer to, right? Because you know that they know your product. And if they don't know your product, you can get in a lot of trouble because they're selling vaporware or they're doing bad implementations, and then it's going to reflect poorly on the company.
A funny story about the partner side and kind of the competitive nature of it. One of the customers we work with is a company called Visma. Think of them like Intuit, but in a European sense. And they're actually partner first. They don't have a direct sales team, which is a very interesting approach. But they have something like 20 different partners and they're competing on being the expert. So they want badges, but they really want to take the examinations because it's part of their pitch to say, we have the most amount of certified people, or we have the highest knowledge, or we have like leaderboards where, oh, we have the person top of the leaderboard within this world. So it can become competitive, and for partners as well. It's a competitive differentiation if you have the most expertise in this area.
Absolutely. We see that over here too. We see that some of the big ones that I've seen it with, every company I've been at has partnered with Deloitte. Most have partnered with Accenture, and you see it there too, that they want all of those certifications. So, and then the smaller companies who want to say, well, we're boutique and we're even better because we're certified in this. The smaller companies can say 100% of my consultants are certified because they have a smaller population is certified too. So there is, to your point, definitely a competitive advantage to it.
As a final little note to go on here, Debbie, I'm curious on your involvement with CEdMA. Obviously, you've been the president of CEdMA for a while now. What kind of drew you to the organization, and what's been some lessons learned being in the seat, so to speak?
Lots and lots of lessons learned. So what drew me to CEdMA was finding my people. Now, what do I mean by that? Finding people who understood what I was trying to do and people I could learn from. So one of the best parts about CEdMA is mentorship, whether it's the formal mentoring program that we have or informal mentoring and conversations. I've learned so much from so many of the people who have come before me and been doing this for a long time. And I joined CEdMA to both learn from them, but to help newer people in customer education learn too. It's really important to me to give back and help others.
It's really nice as well to go and represent your company, but it seems like you're focusing on individuals because a lot of people are doing this maybe for the first time and they don't have that tribe, so to speak.
Exactly. And the reason for focusing on the individual too is that, if you look in SaaS, the average tenure for a director or above is 18 months. So if you focus on just the company, it's all different people. So it's not a support system. People used to stay in their jobs longer, but they don't today. So focusing on individuals and helping individuals advance in their career and helping individuals advance their companies by understanding how to implement good customer education programs is really where our focus is.
I think the mentorship angle you had there as well was really interesting. Have you been a mentor to other people or been a mentee as well?
I've been a mentor to 3 different people through CEdMA. Before we started our mentorship program, I was doing some mentorship outside of it and being mentored by others. It's really a good give and take to learn from other people. One of the hardest things moving from an IC into a leadership role, managing up is really hard. So learning how people are managing up and how they're presenting things to different levels, especially as you start spending more time with the C-suite, figuring out how to talk to them and what's important. They're not all the same. And so everyone says it's really easy once you just do it this way, this way, this way. No, just like the ICs, individual contributors are all different personalities and different types. The same thing with your C-suite. The one thing that's pretty consistent with C-suite is they don't have a lot of time because they're so busy. But figuring out which words resonate with which people is hard. So having people to bounce ideas off of what worked for them is huge.
I mean, it's a pretty universal. You want to make money, you want to reduce spend or reduce risk, but how you're pitching that is so different. How you're pitching to a CMO is, how can I get this lead to convert better? How can I prove by educating a lead that they're actually going to be a good one? Sales, how do I convert the opportunities? Customer success, how do we retain clients? It's such a different skill set that probably one of the most underrated skills, I would say, as an education leader. Because if you do it right, you're starting with the foundation that people believe you can make that impact, which is one of the biggest issues if you're midway doing it, because then you're trying to prove it and you don't have the data. So how have you done some of that pitching when you've been in organizations?
One of the other functions that I find that customer education teams form is a unification of language. Every company I've gone into, each team, and sometimes within teams, everyone talks about things differently. So sort of unifying and figuring out what everyone's actually saying is part of the big problem. Understanding how each team is measured, I have found, is the biggest part. So really spending that time to understand. At some companies I've had, like, monthly active users matter. So it was really more important to get monthly active users up than to do other things. So understanding what's most important at the C level and then across the C level and the VP level, and really making sure that when I'm talking to them, I'm talking about what matters to them and what their goals are and how we can help assist their goals. That's really how you have to get things done. But figuring out what they're actually measuring, high level OKRs, you're going to impact those. But if you don't understand what their teams below them are being measured on, you can speak to that high level and still totally miss out because you miss what they were actually talking about when they were measuring it, because we all use different words.
Absolutely. I think figuring out and asking a question like, okay, if you could improve one metric and look really good, if it's to the CEO or to the CMO, if you're a VP, what would that be? And trying to incorporate that, becoming almost like an investigator and incorporating that into your education strategy, and then making sure you're delivering upon that is the best way to build influence, because they see you as a way to reach your goals, not as a blocker or someone else that they basically have to deal with. But that influence piece, I think, is the critical aspect.
It really is. And there's always, the sort of standard magic wand question, which C-suite gets asked all the time, but it really is helpful. If you had a magic wand and you could use the customer education team to meet your goals, what would you have them do that would assist your goals? Then incorporating what they actually say is huge. And you find when you do that is they'll all tell you things that overlap. So then you can use the overlapping piece to meet everyone's goals at the same time. That's how you succeed.
It's almost like how you're doing the job task analysis for building the program is what you do with execs. Like, it's the same exercise, but in different ways. You're mapping it to the users and ensuring that you're building programs in the correct way.
I had never thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. That's exactly what we need to do.
Very fun. So as a summary then, Debbie, it sounds like if you're a new customer education leader, start with badging, figure out metrics and get small wins and ensure that you're finding out the right metrics in the organizations. I think safe to say as well, certifications matter. You can really use them to boost your company's goals, and they are a worthwhile endeavor. And I guess the other bit is find your tribe. CEdMA seems like a really great place to find mentors, share experiences, be part of a bigger community. And I think that's a really important thing to do as well in this era when there's so much changing around us.
Exactly right. That community with CEdMA is just there to support you, to help you figure things out and get through it. So the community is huge.
Amazing. This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Debbie, for kindly taking your time. Really appreciated all the insights, and I'm sure all the audience would as well. We'll link to CEdMA and everything else in the episode, so hope lots of people can find their tribe with CEdMA here. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Harold.
So that's it for this conversation. I'm going to keep going down rabbit holes as we explore the weird and wonderful world of learning and development. If you want my full wrap-up and takeaways, Subscribe to my newsletter where I'll connect all the dots.